Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM, and today I'm going to be bringing you another unscripted uh, video because my brain and ADHD and just getting things done in my life, such as writing script for these, has been difficult. I'm working on it, and hopefully I'll do better this month, December, thanks to the power of Christmas magic, because I love this time of year. I love snow and I love Christmas, so hopefully this will get me up doing a better job. So today, we're going to be recapping the Sands of Calimare campaign for the final week of November 2019. This session titled Party Split. So, taking up where we left off in the last video, the two parties had decided they were going separate ways for the evening. Blair, seen in the image here, um, it was going to be journeying with Rioch, Moors, and Grenier to try and infiltrate the Obelisk, discover what this cult is doing there and why, and if she can, and if they can, stop them. While the other two members of the party, Aesir, who's also in the image here, our little fox ranger, our kitsune, and Kieran, the kitsune bard, would act as Magnus's bodyguards to this royal dinner. This nobleman sort of posh. It's when we get together to discuss the business, you know. Uh, and so that's where we take off with the two parties going their separate ways. During the trip to the dinner party, Magnus had a talk with Aesir and Kieran, explaining the proper etiquette they're expected to follow, the sort of mannerisms they're expected to do, and just, laying down the groundwork. Because Magnus is actually like an extremely high ranking noble. Technically, his family is not part of the Duralian Empire. They're from their own nation, their own kingdom, within the mountain shard. Uh, but they also are one of the three ruling families of that dwarven hold, which is a pretty big, like, mega city within the mountain for dwarves. That has recouped a lot in the 2,000 or so years since the Age of War, when the city was taken by the Duralian Empire. Uh, so Magnus actually throws around like a lot of political power within Calimare. Uh, that no one else in the group really understands yet, because no one's from Calimare, and they didn't really understand Magnus's position. Magnus, of course, doesn't really care about his position, especially where he found these friends out traveling, but where now they're going to be around him in a social situation. He had to quickly brief them on the correct way to act and how to refer to him if they have to refer to him and that sort of thing. Eventually, they made their way around the palace gardens to the appropriate manor. I believe it was the manor of Lord Zaken, which is this great dome sort of structure. It has an external wall, and then there's about 100 feet of clearance, and then there's an internal wall of this sort of bleached sandstone with four large uh, towers at the corners of the wall. The wall doesn't appear to be too big. You could probably have like a one person patrolling each wall without bumping into each other. It looks like there's a little bit more room in the towers. Um, Beyond this secondary wall, there is a large domed building, and that is the main house of the manor. However, as approaching, Magnus, after speaking with the guard for a moment who asked about Magnus's sudden change in bodyguards, and inquired about Magnus's cousin. Apparently, Magnus and this man have a bit of a rapport, and they didn't ask why he was curious about Magnus's cousin, so you don't get to know. Uh, Upon which they enter. Instead of entering this domed building, though, Magnus goes, I believe the dining hall's around the back. And they sort of walk around the building into this large open garden. And there's this slightly raised structure, a very elongated, very long building, which about 4 feet high has about a foot and a half of this sort of deeply tinted glass running all the way around it, giving it a view out of, into the garden, uh, in the main dining hall. As they approached, the human valet of the house opened the door and allowed them to go in after a brief introduction and going in and announcing Magnus's presence. Upon entering, Magnus found, and the party found, that everyone was already sitting. That they had arrived fashionably late, which was actually their goal. Um, and Magnus quickly found a seat to sit himself in that was appropriate. Uh, Technically, it probably was a little too far away from the action for Magnus's political position, but he also didn't want to make people move, just because it would have caused more issues than not, most likely. And Magnus knows how to play that sort of field. At which point, Kieran and Aesir went into spy mode, i.e., they basically stood there serving as his bodyguards, but tried to listen in on all of his conversations and get a feel of what was going on with him and understand, try and figure out who here might be members of the cult. And as he was sitting down, uh, the bald monk man, the man who had killed Ambar's cousin Radek, came around from a chair on the other side of the room where Lord Zaken was sitting. A man with very long, flowing red hair and a very large braided beard with these crimson robes and very red eyes. Uh, that's Lord Zaken. And Karen, the head of the cult, the leader of these particular cultists, they don't know yet, um, came around and took his own seat next to the Lord, which pretty quickly painted that Lord Zaken was most likely in league with the cult. And Aesir and Kieran had a bit of a moment restraining themselves, but they managed to keep their cool. During the first part of the party, uh, Magnus spoke a little bit to the woman beside him, a Lady Naad of House Naad, whose baby was there. She's the acting Tsar Regent. Um, the conversation was pretty inane, and uh, they didn't really pick anything up of importance. However, after this conversation, a woman from across the table started speaking to Magnus. And I'm just trying to pull up her name here in my notes. It was... This is the problem with this dinner. There's so many. Ah, yes. Um, so she calls out to Magnus, this older woman in this very fine black dress with this sort of gray patterning to it that almost looks like spider webs or crawling vines and trees. And there's this row of onyx and emerald gemstones, this pattern across her chest that at first seemed very random. Uh, and this lady, who they learned was Lady Hrina, uh, first name Anessa. Uh, Kieran was sort of really focused in on this part of the conversation. And she seemed to have overheard Magnus saying something to Corinna Naad. And she got the feeling, Kieran did, that uh, Anessa is extremely bitter towards Magnus about something. And there was just this odd tension between Anessa and her daughters who were sitting nearby. The whole conversation was interesting to watch. I don't know how much information they took from it, but it definitely gave Anessa this air to her that something was uncomfortable. After the main course arrived, this beautiful arrangement of large meat, uh, meats, and delicious seasonal vegetables and fruits, the dinner party sort of got up for a little while of standing and chatting while sipping on wine and meads, the finer ales that could be acquired, that sort of thing. Uh, as the tables were cleared, cleaned, and dessert was prepared. During this time, uh, Magnus was approached by Lord Babu, if I'm not mistaken, who's on page. Where are you, Babu? Or was that your first name and you're actually. Nope. Here we go. Yes, sorry. Lord Valtur, whose first name is Babu, and Magnus seemed to know the man quite well. He was also approached by Lord Hattusli. Lord Hattusli seemed very brazen and charismatic, this sort of square set jaw, sort of beautifully coiffed black hair that has a bit of a gray streak in it, but looks very dignified. Um, and he was talking to Magnus, and Babu Voltaire sort of interjected this stuff. This very serious, bald black man, and Magnus was talking with both of them for a moment, and then it became clear to Aesir that a game was happening between the two. Uh, Babu seemed very upset with the presence of Karen and his ilk within the boundaries of the city, um, and was just uncomfortable with him being a part of this dinner where he felt the man had no place being. But and they were sort of fighting at each other with words and covering it up. Aesir, who was paying very close attention to the conversation, picked up parts of it. It seemed that Hattusli had information on Babu. He had something. It was poking with it, using it, and throwing Babu off. And whenever Magnus tried to come in and interject to try and defend, it ended up making things worse. Magnus was having a hard time because he didn't know the information that Hattusli knows and Babu knows. So he ended up accidentally giving more ammunition to Hattusli. Uh, and seeing that he had fucked up, when the conversation shifted to the Duralian pantheon and Meridia, the goddess of life, fertility, and light, Magnus dove into the conversation, interjecting with a story about Helga the Firebrand, the one female dwarf demigod who also represents fertility. And just completely derailed the conversation to try to save Babu from whatever was making him uncomfortable. The other conversations were a little bit too hushed or separated for the rest of the party to hear. And eventually, a messenger came. The valet opened the door and called to learn Karen, explaining that a message had been received that one of his followers would be arriving momentarily with a message for him. If he could wait for him outside, it would be appreciated. Karen, a little confused, went outside. Of course, Aesir, Kieran, and Magnus were terrified at this point in the evening that something happened to their friends who were assaulting the obelisk, and that somehow the message might pertain to them. So they rushed outside for their own reason, Magnus explaining that he wanted to send a message to his father and had access to a private room within the main house for this. So, of course, as his bodyguards, Kieran and Aesir joined him. Um, so they went out first before Karen left the building. Aesir and Karen taking a position by the door to the main house, hidden out of view as Karen came outside to await the messenger. And it was at this point that they had the opportunity to try to stop the messenger, trick Karn, do anything. At one point, Karen tried sending a message, or sorry, Kieran. Their names are very similar, and it fucks my brain up. Kieran tried sending a message to Karn to try and trick him, but he didn't seem to fall for it. Uh, And not having another better option, she turned into Blair and just walked into the garden and confronted him, which he didn't really react to. Karn is smart enough to know not to start a fight in this area and give them a legitimate reason to fight back, especially with Magnus around, since they've aligned themselves with someone extremely powerful within political circles. He couldn't just use his position next to Lord Zakan or other lords to just, it's my word versus theirs, because Magnus would undoubtedly go against him, and it would be his word against Magnus's, and that's not a position he'd want to be in. And while this was happening, Aesir was trying to figure out what to do. Uh, Kieran sort of walked around the garden to get to the other side of Karn, uh, but Aesir just he changed forms a few times. He sort of panically changed form into Karen first, and got rid of that, and then panically changed forms into one of the bodyguards and picked the wrong one, not the one he wanted, so he changed it again to a different one of the bodyguards from inside. Uh, and the messenger was getting closer, and they didn't do anything. They just kind of did nothing. So the messenger arrived. Aesir kind of froze up, and Kieran was able to hear roughly what they were talking about. The messenger arrived and apparently explained to Karen that a group within the Grand Bazaar had purchased several magic items that were on the cult's hit list. Uh, but he believed that one of the members of this party who bought these things was possibly some sort of giant in disguise and was requesting more men to deal with the issue. They had heard rumors in the previous session that people purchasing magic items that weren't noblemen, so groups of adventurers and whatnot, buying magical items or stocking up on magical items, like potions or scrolls, were getting waylaid in the streets. This sort of revealed that it was the cultists doing it to prevent anyone within the city from amassing a large amount of magical means to sort of shut down the cult if they end up going to some massive battle. They're very clearly preventing other people from building up magical power. Uh, Karen, still confused with the presence of Aesir and Kieran, but like intrigued more than upset, simply informed the man to go pick up some men, and he told him that there was about a squad or so patrolling the obelisk, and that he could take a few from that patrol. So the cultists ran off and left, and Karen looked at Blair one last time and just sort of shrugged before going back in. Uh, at which time Kieran and Aesir reconnoitered, and Magnus came out of the building uh, and asked what had happened, and the answer was basically nothing, because they hadn't done anything to waylay the messenger or trick Karen successfully. And so they all went to go back inside. And that's where we ended the session. However, before the end of the session, so during this, we were sort of jumping back and forth between the two games. So now that we've seen what happened at the dinner party up until this point, it's time to, strike that reverse card and go all the way back to the beginning to the Obelisk infiltration party. Uh, so on their way towards the Obelisk, they decided a few things. One, they were going to re-enter the Grand Bazaar, cross over the border between the Grand Bazaar and the Palace Gardens, to get over to a place known as the Trade Dens. Yes, which is more like a red light district. It has the largest situation of criminals, the crime bosses, a lot of trade princes, non-noblemen, but extremely affluent and rich traders. Brothel, drug dens, gambling halls, all exist within the trade dens. They were going to cross through the trade dens, which borders the obelisk and the shadows, which is basically the slums where the poor and the unskilled laborers live. Uh, Not technically slaves, but like basically the people who don't have the money or power to do what they want to do in life and are just doing what they can to survive. So, after exploring through the drain dens a little bit, Blair ended up bumping into an odd man wearing quite similar leather clothing. His was a bit more elaborate, and he had these white bandages wrapped around his neck and face, and his hood was up. And Blair didn't get a chance to see his face very well, but after they bumped into each other and sort of fell back a step, she apologized and he just said, no worries, and walked around her and kept going. But as he did, everyone in the party noticed that all the people out on the balconies doing drugs, or the prostitutes on their balconies and at their windows calling to try and lure people into their brothels, uh, and that the streets that are usually pretty busy in the trade dens had emptied. Like, this guy was clearing streets as he walked by. And there was a moment for Ryok to know who he was or have an idea or rumors about him being a local to Shiram, but he rolled a 2 on his history check, so he doesn't get to know, therefore you don't get to know. Um, Upon which time they continued on forward, getting to the small fence that surrounds the area of the obelisk, where the guards patrol it. Uh, Blair decided to go to the shadows, assuming that there would be less guards on that side. However, after exploring down into the shadows a little bit, uh, she quickly discovered that they, in fact, had triple the guard on that side because they definitely didn't want the riffraff and scum trying to get closer. Whereas the other side, everyone is a bit more posh, has access to money, or is just like a high or drunk or a prostitute. So, like, odds are those people are going to try and mess with the obelisk anyway. So they actually discovered that there was less guard in the previous part of the city. So they doubled back. Moores wanted to fly up and get a decent idea of what was going on. So he went to fly up, crashed his head into a sign, fell into the arms of this large, burly prostitute who has a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow, huge titties, way too much makeup. Uh, Not ugly, but just like very clearly didn't have a very professional hand applying their makeup. Who caught this devil tiefling with wings and was just immediately smitten with this exotic man who fell into her arms. And Moores quickly ran the fuck away, flying straight up, but causing a bit of a scene because of all the noise and the racket and his poor stealth check. He noticed where the opening into the obelisk was and where they wanted to go. Uh, Using Moores as a distraction, Blair tumbled forward, darted across, and jumped the small wall, fucking up their stealth check as well, fumbling and sort of sliding down the sandy hill to the base, where large chunks of black sandstone are sort of arrayed for where they'd blasted and chunked away at the obelisk to get this entryway they created. Uh, Hiding close, and thankfully Moores was causing such a distraction that Blair didn't get caught or anything. Grenier took chase, as did uh, Ryok, I believe. But before Ryok left, he shot up a few guiding bolts into the sky, just pew 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 pew, as little like bursts of light to distract everyone as Morse like collapsed his wings and just fell to the ground as quickly as possible, taking a little bit of damage from the fall, but not too much. Um, Once back on the ground, Moores uh, also followed them across the fence, gliding down, and the bunch of them got down, pressed tight against the sandstone bricks, hidden out of sight. While there, looking into the maw of this obelisk, this opening that had been artificially created, they got the glimpse of people inside, voices, before hearing them move away to the left. Blair, who still has 2 levels of exhaustion, mind you, decided she would go in and check what was going on. So she crept up to the entryway, knew that other people had gone left, and so decided to go right. Inside the obelisk, the pathways and floorways are sort of lined with this dull blue steel, and there seems to be this band, this strip running by at about waist height that just emits this constant dark royal blue glow, and it very quickly just oversaturates everything, to the point where it's actually jarring to the eyes and a little painful. Uh, but Blair adapted to it quickly enough and pushed on, where she discovered one of the cultists, possibly, dead with a few bolts in him. He probably tripped some sort of trap. Moving on past this, she accidentally stepped into what I call a magical pitfall. It's a pitfall that's about 1 inch deep, but it has this magical alchemical formula to it. The real magic comes in the fact that it reseals itself and that it's only 1 inch deep. Blair failed any sort of save to avoid. Uh, well, there's no save to avoid the trap once you trigger it, because it's not like a regular pitfall where you fall down. You just step on something and your foot sinks 1 inch, basically. Uh, However, stepping into the goop caused Blair a little bit of poison damage. I believe about 7 points, but even with their levels of exhaustion, they passed their constitution save and jumped forward. Uh, but it still made a pretty large sound, and Blair heard someone to her left go, "What was that?" And the sound of someone like putting away what they were rummaging with to go investigate the sound. Panicking, she started to run into a different hallway because this hallway she had turned into branches on 2 different sides. Um, and as she ran this way, she triggered an actual pitfall, but a 20-foot pit. However, she managed to pass the reflex save and dive across, grab a hold of the other edge, pull herself up, and get around the corner just as the cultist across the hallway from her came around his corner. But he didn't see her. He wandered over, saw the magically sealing uh, trap reclosing, and saw this new pitfall across the hall from him just swinging open. The doors pushed down now into this pit, and he looked around confused. Very clearly didn't see Blair, but was still very confused what was going on, and sort of muttered to himself, better go get the guys. And Blair, on her own, over 100 feet away from the rest of the group, panicked and figured she could probably kill the guy in a single hit, especially with her assassin subclass, which, as a flavor note, just feels very on Blair-like. Uh, and I bring this up to the player all the time. Uh, it just, assassin doesn't feel like Blair. Blair feels more like a mastermind or a thief, uh, not a cold-blooded killer. uh, but hey, assassins mechanically are very strong. So Blair jumped out and whipped the dagger, missed, whipped it a second time, got the hit, got the sneak attack damage, but didn't down him. So the buddy looked at her and went, "Oh fuck," and just ran off, and started calling for his allies. However, in his panic, he forgot the magical trap and ended up taking 1 poison damage and getting poisoned. So he got pretty hurt. Blair did almost half of his total hit points in a single hit. And then getting poisoned, he was in a pretty bad state. Uh, Hearing and seeing the other guards coming running back the way Blair had gone, everyone else was like, fuck, we have to get in there. And what pursued, what happened then was a fight that took up most of their time this session. Grenier, Moores, and Riok rushed in uh, to try and help. They ended up fighting 2 of the guards, the one that Blair had stabbed and the poisoned one, and one other, blocking their entryway to the hallway, while the other 3 uh, made their jump across the pit and ended up hitting Blair in a corner, who was quickly running out of hit points, even with taking the dodge action, getting 3 attacks on her with disadvantage, and they didn't have like a super good bonus to hit, but they also didn't have a super bad bonus to hit. I would argue these guys were very average. Um, so even though I was getting 3 attacks, they were all with disadvantage. So about 1 in 3 of them would manage to hit for a solid amount of damage, about 1d8 plus 2. Uh, and I tend to roll higher than not when it comes to damage. Sometimes it was hot streaking tonight. Uh, and Blair was too panicked to start attacking these men to try and get her way free. Uh, and they had blocked the passageway behind them, giving her no exit other than to go deeper into the room she was in. While this was happening, Moores was doing a fair bit of damage. Riok was blowing through the rest of his spells with healing and trying to get away and into where Blair was, knowing that Blair was in trouble. Uh, Eventually, Moores dropped one of the guys down, fighting with his scimitar and hand crossbow. And Grenier took out the other one in his blood rage. Uh, but at this point, Blair had gone down. The cultists, not really understanding what was going on, didn't immediately kill her. They heard fighting behind them and knew something was going on, uh, so they wanted to bind her up and take her prisoner. So they quickly just sort of sealed her wounds that they gave her and tied her up. Uh, Gagged her and just were like, spit roasting her, kind of tying her up. What's it called? Hog tying. There, that's the word, not spit roasting. That's something else entirely. They hog tied her, hands and legs behind her back, and a gag in her mouth. She was unconscious, and they went to go rejoin their friends. At which point, Riok and Moore showed up, and the rest of the fight ensued. Two of them made their way across and were doing some decent damage to Moore's. Riok ended up getting critically hit earlier when he tried to rush around the one guard that was still alive, fighting Moore's and Grenier. He ended up taking a critical hit, which was pretty bad. And now that he could see Blair, he threw out a healing ward to wake her up. And Blair spent her round undoing her bindings and escaping from the hog tie. One of the cultists actually fell down the pit and was stuck down there for the rest of the fight after taking a bit of fall damage. He never was able to successfully climb back up. And the one time he almost did, Blair shot his hand and sent him back down, or threw her dagger at his hand. Uh, During this time, as the other guard got beheaded by Grenier, uh, the one guard who was still in the fight and not down the pit panicked and then rolled like a natural 20 on his perception check, uh, because at this point he decided he was going to run and try to get somewheres better to regroup or contact the cult proper. But there was something in the hallway that a very high perception check could have noticed. Um, and I rolled him with disadvantage because of the fight and how crazy he was at the moment, like everything going wrong. Uh, However, he rolled a 19 and a 20, so he discovered something weird looking about the wall at the end of the tunnel, and just his panic glancing. Uh, Almost like it didn't load in properly until a second after he saw it. Uh, Choosing to believe what he's seen, or out of sheer desperation, he took the disengage action, ran down the hallway towards the dead end, and then ran through the wall. At which point, Grenier dove down into the pit and impaled the guy down there on his halberd. Uh, Pulling his way back up, and Blair hopping her way across the pitfall. Riok, who had given chase to the cultist, discovered that the wall was illusory or semi-real, and that if you tried hard and believed you were going to go through it, you could push your way through the wall. Not seeing the cultist immediately, but instead seeing a spiral staircase going up. Uh, However, there was also this low roar coming from around the corner and a bright orange light. Riok, deciding to investigate that, followed it around the corner of this stairwell to another invisible wall, this other fake, illusory, semi real wall. Poking his head out through that, he looked to the right and saw nothing, and looked left and saw the body of the cultist just getting assailed by these like maws of dragon fire. These just torrents of dragon fire pouring from the wall. As in his panic, he ended up tripping one of the traps, uh, and he had been pretty freaking weak uh, when he decided to run. So the group got back. Ryok explained what had happened and what he'd discovered with the walls, and they sort of patched up their wounds as best they could. But like, they were out of spell slots already, and Blair had gone down, and things were looking pretty rough. I'm not sure if Ryuk used their healing potion or not, but I think they did as well. So suffice to say, the first fight with the Obelisk went pretty wild. And that was the session. These two things happening at the same time, going back and forth in between them. Um, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. If you have any questions, comments, or inquiries about either the campaign, the players, or the world, please leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to interact and dialogue about them. Thank you for listening. Be sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button. Have a great day.